This video is brought to you by ULTRAGAME. Stick around to the end of the video to learn how you can win some free, officially licensed NFL merchandise. Also join me tonight on Twitch at 9 PM Eastern where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes. Link to play below. And now, on with our feature presentation. Some of the best hires in the history of the NFL have been retread head coaches that didn't quite cut it out in their first stint. Or maybe their first stint ended on a sour note and they just needed a change of scenery. And then, they absolutely crushed it in their second stint. Bill Belichick was not great whatsoever with the Cleveland Browns. The New England Patriots then hired him, and the rest is history, as he's arguably the greatest coach of all time. Pete Carroll wasn't too successful in the 90s when he was with the New York Jets and the New England Patriots, but a decade later, the Seattle Seahawks hired him, and they won their first Super Bowl in franchise history. Gary Kubiak was below 500 in his time with the Houston Texans, and seemed to be on the hot seat more often than not. He goes to the Denver Broncos, and immediately wins the Super Bowl. And then, there's plenty of guys like Andy Reid, Tom Coughlin, and Dick Vermeil that were successes with their first team, and then went to another team and won a ring, and did very well there. However, not everyone makes the most of their second chance. Sometimes, retread head coaching hires can be some of the worst hires in NFL history. Rich Kodak was a retread hire when the New York Jets hired him after his unsuccessful tenure with the Philadelphia Eagles. He was notoriously bad, and you can learn more about him by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Hugh Jackson was a retread hire when the Cleveland Browns hired him after he got canned after one season with the Oakland Raiders. If you're from Australia and you're looking at the records upside down, Jackson is the greatest coach in NFL history. In America, he's one of the worst. Mike Mularkey got hired by the Jacksonville Jaguars after an unsuccessful stint with the Buffalo Bills. What followed was a 2-14 record, the worst in football, and an immediate canning. I could go on and on. And with that, we need to talk about Josh McDaniels, because holy cow, his tenure with the Las Vegas Raiders has been an unquestioned disaster thus far. I think a lot of people, and rightfully so, including myself, were wondering what the heck the Raiders were thinking when they hired this man in the first place, especially since the Raiders had arguably the most attractive head coaching vacancy in the offseason and could have picked just about anyone. They opted for Josh McDaniels, despite the fact that his tenure when he was a head coach with the Denver Broncos a decade ago was a disaster, as he went 11-17, with the team losing 17 of its final 22 games under him. Despite the fact that the Bill Belichick coaching tree, if you're hiring a guy directly from the Patriots, has rarely, if ever, worked out. Despite the fact that there were numerous reports about his immaturity and his inability to handle what it took to be a head coach, and despite the stunt he pulled in the 2018 offseason with the Indianapolis Colts, where he accepted that coaching gig and then backed out at the last second, screwing over the Colts in the process. Despite all of that, somehow, the Raiders thought that this man was qualified to be a head coach and get a second chance, even if he definitely should have been blackballed after what he did with the Colts. The results so far have been ugly with a capital U. Through 3 weeks, the Raiders are the only team in football to be 0-3. In a league that has been defined this year by anybody being able to beat anybody, the Raiders have been defined by being able to beat absolutely nobody. And it's not like their schedule has been a gauntlet thus far. Their 3 opponents that they played in every other game have combined to go 0-6. One of these losses was a 29-23 overtime loss at home to the Arizona Cardinals, where they led 23-7 with 9 minutes left, and somehow lost it, thanks to some abysmal play calling and some atrocious defense that made you think you were watching a game of Madden with the way Kyler Murray was just running around everyone. Things have gotten so bad that after just 3 games, owner Mark Davis had a closed-door meeting with McDaniels, and while we can only speculate as to what was said in that meeting, the vibes were definitely not good. Safe to say, McDaniels' second stint as a head coach is as much of a disaster as his first, and it's not looking like it's going to get better anytime soon. But here's the thing. Josh McDaniels isn't just bad with the Raiders. He's historically bad. No exaggeration, no joke, no recency bias, no hyperbole, no none of that. There are very few coaches that have gotten off to as bad of a start as McDaniels has, and of the ones that have, not a single one of them has worked out. And that's where I did some digging. I looked at every coach in NFL history since the NFL AAFC merger at the start of the 1950 season. So going back over 70 years to have a second stint start off this poorly after doing absolutely nothing in their first stint. It's a fairly small list, and it's not a giant sample size, but the names on the list should be extremely alarming to Raiders fans and just about everyone. To the point where if the Raiders wanted to be like the Jaguars last year and just cut ties with their head coach before the end of the first season, I'm not sure anyone would complain or bat an eye. To qualify for this list, I have 3 criteria. And before I break down the criteria, keep in mind that I'm only focusing on the NFL, and I'm restricting this list from 1950 on, from the time of the merger with the AAFC. Simply because if I didn't do that, you'd have a bunch of situations with defunct teams and player coaches where there wasn't a whole lot of structure, and that wouldn't be in the spirit of the list. Number 1, you had to have a losing record in your first stint as a head coach. I don't want to look at guys that had even the slightest bit of success the first time around, to the point where you could justify to some extent giving them a second chance. You had to be below 500 as a coach. Number 2, you could not have won a playoff game in your first stint as a head coach. As an example of why I put this rule in place, if I didn't, then if they qualified, which they don't, guys like Rex Ryan and Weeb Ewbank, both of whom were very successful coaches with the Jets, but had a record below 500 when all was said and done, would be eligible. And that's not in the purpose of the list. And number 3, you had to start your second stint off with an 0-3 record, just like McDaniels has done. You need to start off the second verse as disastrously as the first, where your season might be over before it even got started. So just to recap, I'm looking at every retread head coach who got a job after having a losing record and no success in the playoffs the first time around, and then started off 0-3 the second time around, where it looks like there's still a bad head coach. Prior to Josh McDaniels and his arrival with the Raiders, there are 5 guys to meet that criteria. Yes, 5 isn't the largest sample size in the world, but you cannot make an argument for any of the 5 guys on this list that their second stint worked out. The 5 guys on this list make for an incredibly alarming group, and the fact that McDaniels is in this group should be raising red flags all along the strip. Starting with the earliest name on the list. In 1952, the Pittsburgh Steelers decided to rehire Joe Bach as their head coach. Bach was the coach of the Steelers for 2 years from 1935 to 36, and it didn't work out. The team went 10-14 in his time there. But a decade and a half later, the Steelers brought him back. It got off to a really bad start, as the Steelers started 0-4 that season. By the time his second stint with the Steelers ended, he went 11-13, winning just over 45% of his games. And keep in mind, that's the highest winning percentage of any coach that makes it on this list. Seriously. 2 years later, Washington decided that it would be a good idea to hire former Chicago Cardinals head coach Joe Kuharich, even though in his only season as the coach of the Cards in 1952, they went 4-8 and finished tied for last in the American Division. And this decision did not pan out at all. Things got off on the wrong foot when he assumed the position in 1954, and Washington started off 0-5, getting outscored 202-63 over their first 5 games. That's an average of just under 28 points per game. They were losing games to start off by an average of 4 touchdowns. And things didn't get a whole lot better for the rest of his tenure. He finished his 5-year stint in the nation's capital with a 26-32-2 record, and no playoff appearances, although Washington did finish 8-4 in 1955, which is, of the 12 seasons coached by people on this list, the only one with a winning record. Oddly enough, after Kuharich got fired, Washington hired Mike Nixon, who was even worse. In his 2 seasons with the team from 1959 to 60, he went 4-18-2. But the Pittsburgh Steelers saw this and decided in 1965, when Buddy Parker quit the team, that he was the best possible candidate to be their next head coach. The result was one of the worst seasons in the history of the Steelers, which is impressive, seeing as their franchise's existence up until this point had been nothing but pain. The team started 0-5, finishing 2-12 with the worst offense and the 3rd worst defense in football, and Nixon was replaced after 1 season with a winning percentage of 14.3%. After that, we had a dry spell for roughly half a century, until the Cleveland Browns decided in 2009 that it was a good idea to hire Eric Mangini following his 3-year stint with the New York Jets, in which players absolutely despised him. Mangini coached the Jets to a 23-25 record, massively underachieving with the team, especially in 2008, where they had all the talent to make a run to the Super Bowl, and they didn't even make it to the playoffs. But the Browns saw something in him, and whatever they saw turned out to be very incorrect, with the low light of his micromanagement being the time that he fined a player over $1,700 for not paying for a $3 bottle of water. The Browns started the 2009 season with an 0-4 record, and Mangini was fired after 2 seasons with the team, where he went 5-11 both times, finished with an awful record of 10-22, and won just over 31% of his games. And finally, the last coach filling up this list is the guy that is regarded by many as arguably the worst head coach in NFL history to ever make it to the playoffs. It was one of the most confusing hires of all time when it happened, because no one on planet Earth but the front office thought it had a shot at working out, and it seemed like everyone actually got better when they weren't coached by this man. But in 2019, the New York Jets decided to hire Adam Gase, immediately after he finished a 3-year stint where he went 23-25 with the Dolphins. Almost immediately, you could tell this was going to be a train wreck. The Jets started off 0-4, and somehow he lasted a second season, where the Jets went 2-14 and lost 13 straight to start off. His Jets tenure was a disaster, and was so bad that Lou Holtz and Rich Kodite actually have competition for the worst tenure by any head coach in team history, which is saying a lot. Gase went 9-23 with the Jets, winning just over 28% of his games. So that's the entire list. In the last 3/4 of a century, there were 5 coaches that had awful, unsuccessful first stints, got a second opportunity, and got off to a horrible start. Combined, they coached 12 seasons in the NFL. Combined, they have 0 playoff appearances between them, with just 1 winning record. Combined in their second stint, they have a winning percentage of 36%, which comes out to about a 6-11 record over the course of a 17-game season. Joe Buck, Joe Kuharich, Mike Nixon, Eric Mangini, and Adam Gase. Whatever the opposite of being an elite company is, that's what it's like to be on that list. And now, you can add Josh McDaniels to the fold. Josh McDaniels' second stint has been such a disaster that he is in the same company as Adam Gase and Eric Mangini. And amazingly enough, that might be an insult to those 2 men, because they at least made the playoffs their first time around. There's still time for Josh McDaniels to turn things around and right the ship. We're 3 games into a 17-game season. But if history is anything to go off of, it is incredibly unlikely that things are going to change. If you were bad the first time, your leash is significantly shorter than if you were a first-time head coach. And you need to show right away that you learn your lessons from your previous failure, as measured primarily through wins and losses. And McDaniels has not done that at all to start off. I know Howard Jones once said that things can only get better, but knowing what we know about NFL history and the company that McDaniels is in, that is not the case whatsoever. Because if I had to put my money on the history of the NFL or Josh McDaniels, I know which one I'm placing my money down on every single time. One thing is for sure. It seems on the surface like hiring Josh McDaniels was a really bad idea. But you know what's not a bad idea? Buying officially licensed NFL products from ULTRAGAME, the sponsor of today's video. ULTRAGAME has officially licensed products for all 32 teams. From t-shirts, to tank tops, to long sleeve shirts, to hoodies, to shorts, to fleece pants, ULTRAGAME has it all, and at incredibly affordable prices too. The Jaguars might actually make the playoffs this year, which is kinda nuts to think about. And if they host a game and I'm there, I'll need some clothes to keep me warm in January, which is why ULTRAGAME was kind enough to send me these incredibly comfy pants for me to wear that fit perfectly. If you want to get your hands on apparel like that, all you have to do is use my link in the description. Not only do you get some sweet merch, but if you use my link, it helps the channel out a lot. And that's not all, because from now until September 30th, if you like this video, subscribe to my channel and ULTRAGAME, whose channel you can go to by either clicking the link in the description or by clicking the card in the upper right corner, and comment below on what your favorite team or player is, then one lucky fan is going to win one of these awesome apparel items. You must be in the United States to win. So special thanks to ULTRAGAME for hooking me up for this NFL season, and special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.